They thought she was powerless. Just another face in the crowd. Another woman who had stepped into a courtroom where her voice didn't matter. The gavel hadn't even struck. And yet the atmosphere was already heavy with arrogance and quiet intimidation. Then it happened. An officer's hand lashed across her face, the sound of the slap echoing off the marble walls like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the room. People froze, unsure whether to look away or stare. To them, it looked like the end of her dignity. But in reality, it was the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. Because moments later, the very same woman would rise, not broken, not silenced, and walk toward the judge's chair as if it had always been hers. Before we dive into this story, take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment with your thoughts. These stories are meant to make you think, to pull you in, to challenge the way you see the world. So if you're ready for the unexpected, stick with me, because what happens next will make your jaw drop. Now let's rewind. You don't get to a moment like this without a storm building behind the scenes. The woman at the center of it all, her name whispered like a secret down courthouse hallways, was no stranger to adversity. She had grown up where respect wasn't handed to you. You had to claw it out of the world with bare hands. She wasn't raised to bow her head. She was raised to survive, to endure, and to stand tall even when people tried to shove her down. On that particular morning, she walked into court knowing eyes would follow her. Not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented, defiance in the face of power. She wore no armor but her resolve. Every step she took across the tiled floor sounded louder than it should have, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness. You could feel it, the tension in the air, the unspoken hostility. People don't like it when someone refuses to play the role they've been assigned. And in this courtroom, her role was supposed to be small, silent, insignificant. But she was about to flip that script. The officers who stood near her weren't just keeping order. They were enforcing a narrative. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted the crowd to see her as less, to shrink her down until she barely existed at all. That slap across her face wasn't just about control. It was about sending a message. You don't belong here. You don't speak here. You don't matter here. But the problem with trying to erase someone like her is that she had been erased 1,000 times before, and each time she came back stronger, louder, sharper. And that day, inside that courthouse, she wasn't about to vanish. Instead, she locked eyes with the officer who had struck her. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply stared back with a kind of quiet fire that made everyone else shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was the kind of look that said, "You think you've won, but you just made your biggest mistake." The courtroom was no longer a neutral space. It had become a stage, and without realizing it, the officer had given her the spotlight. The judge cleared his throat, trying to reassert control, but the power in the room had already shifted. Somewhere between the echo of that slap and the silence that followed, she had become something larger than herself. The crowd felt it even if they couldn't name it yet. And soon, they would watch her do the unthinkable. Sit in the very chair from which justice was supposed to flow. Every story that feels like a sudden explosion actually starts with a spark. Long before the officer's hand struck her face, long before the collective gasp of the courtroom, there was a path carved by struggle, injustice, and defiance. To understand why she didn't crumble in that moment, you have to understand where she came from. She grew up in a neighborhood where sirens were louder than lullabies, where every cracked sidewalk and flickering streetlight told a story of abandonment. She watched her mother work 2 jobs, exhausted but unyielding, carrying dignity in her posture even when the world gave her no reason to stand tall. From her father, she inherited not wealth but resilience, the kind you earn when doors slam shut again and again in your face. It was a childhood that taught her a brutal but vital lesson. Nobody was coming to save her. If she wanted to rise, she would have to learn to climb through windows when doors were locked. By the time she was a teenager, she had already stared down the kind of authority that makes most people tremble. Teachers who didn't believe in her, officers who looked at her like a statistic, strangers who crossed the street at the sight of her. Each time, she sharpened herself against their doubt. Each insult became steel in her spine. Each dismissal became fuel for her fire. So when she walked into that courthouse, she wasn't just another woman at the mercy of power. She was a storm contained in flesh and bone, and the slap that tried to break her only let the storm loose. The courtroom crowd didn't know her history. They didn't know about the nights she studied law books borrowed from a dusty library, sitting under a dim lamp with tired eyes but a mind unwilling to quit. They didn't know about the debates she entered in college, where people laughed at her accent until she left them speechless with arguments so sharp they cut through their mockery. They didn't know how many times she had been told she was too much, too loud, too stubborn, too ambitious. What they saw was a woman standing there, struck in the face. What they didn't see was the fire inside her chest that had been burning for years, waiting for this very moment to roar. When the officer's hand made contact, she felt the sting, yes, but she also felt something else. Clarity. That sharp sound didn't humiliate her. It awakened her. She realized in that instant that her presence in this courtroom wasn't accidental. She wasn't here merely to observe justice or to be silenced by its corrupted rituals. She was here to redefine it. The judge shifted in his seat, irritated, tapping the gavel for order. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled and then hushed like a tide. All eyes remained on her. Even the officer, suddenly aware of the gravity of what he'd done, avoided her gaze. She didn't move right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, heavy and unbearable, until it seemed like the very walls were holding their breath. And then she took a step forward. That one step wasn't just a movement across the floor. It was a declaration. Said, "I belong here, more than you know, more than you want me to." Another step followed, and another. The officer tensed, as if ready to restrain her again, but something about her composure stopped him cold. The judge leaned forward, confused, incredulous. The gallery watched in awe, some with fear, some with admiration, not yet sure which side of history they were witnessing. She approached the bench, her pace unhurried, her eyes fixed not on the officer, not on the crowd, but on the chair itself. The judge's chair, elevated above all others, draped in the authority of centuries of tradition. A seat designed to intimidate, a seat designed to remind everyone who held power in that room. But that morning, tradition cracked, and with each step she took, the invisible chains that held her people, her community, her story, seemed to loosen. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or struck down and told to know their place. She was walking for them too, and as she neared the bench, the realization spread across the crowd. They weren't just watching an act of defiance. They were witnessing the rewriting of a script that had been forced upon people like her for generations. The sound of her footsteps against the marble floor seemed louder than they should have been, each one reverberating through the air like the ticking of a clock counting down to something irreversible. Nobody in that courtroom moved. Not the officers, not the judge, not the jurors shifting in their seats. Even the spectators, who had been whispering in disbelief just seconds before, had fallen into stunned silence. It was as if the entire room was paralyzed by the audacity of what they were witnessing. She stopped at the base of the bench. The judge's chair loomed above her, polished wood and worn leather, a symbol of authority built not just on law, but on centuries of ritual. Most people looked at that chair and saw something unreachable, a throne too high for ordinary hands. But her gaze was steady, unwavering. She didn't see a throne. She saw an illusion, a seat that had been guarded by fear and maintained by violence, now stripped bare by a single act of defiance. The judge opened his mouth to speak, to shout, to order her removal, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't explain it, and neither could the others. But there was something in her presence that disarmed him. She wasn't pleading for permission. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't even challenging him directly. She was simply moving as if destiny had pulled her forward, as if this moment had been waiting for her all along. The officer who had slapped her earlier clenched his jaw, his hand twitching at his side, ready to drag her back into the role he believed she belonged in. But he didn't move, not because he was afraid of her physically, but because he was afraid of what it would mean to strike her again. The first slap had already shifted the balance of the room. Another would make him the villain in a story that was no longer under his control. And then, she placed her hand on the arm of the judge's chair. Gasps shot through the gallery. Some stood halfway out of their seats, as if the mere act of her touching it had broken a sacred rule. The judge finally barked out, "Enough!" His voice cracked with strain, as though even he didn't fully believe his authority anymore. But her hand remained there, firm, unflinching, and the silence that followed was heavier than his outburst. She moved slowly, deliberately, and climbed the steps toward the seat. Each step was a blow against the unspoken laws that governed that courtroom. Each step was a reminder that power, when challenged, can tremble on its pedestal. When she finally lowered herself into the chair, the room seemed to exhale all at once. The weight of centuries pressed down on her shoulders, Yet she didn't shrink. She leaned back, her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the room with a calmness that was almost unnerving. For the first time, people weren't just seeing her. They were seeing themselves through her. Some spectators felt a surge of hope, as though they too were sitting in that chair. Others felt fear, realizing how fragile their illusions of control really were. And the officer, the one who had humiliated her just moments earlier, looked small, diminished, a man exposed in his own pettiness. The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. His voice, though sharp, betrayed a tremor. "Get out of that seat." But she didn't move. She didn't need to shout or argue. Her very presence was an argument no one could ignore. Sitting in that chair wasn't about pretending to be judge or seizing authority by force. It was about proving a truth that had always existed but had always been denied. Power is not inherent in a title, a robe, or a chair. Power exists in the courage to stand, or in this case, to sit when everything around you demands that you fall. A murmur rose in the crowd, louder this time. Some voices angry, some in awe. It spread like wildfire, spilling into the hallways beyond the courtroom doors. People craned their necks to see. They whispered her name like it was suddenly more than just a name. It was a statement, a symbol, a rallying cry. And as she sat there, calm and unshaken, it became clear to everyone in that room. The slap hadn't broken her. It had crowned her. The moment she settled into that chair, time fractured. For some, it stretched into an eternity, every second drawn out into slow-motion disbelief. For others, it collapsed in a heartbeat, as though everything they thought they knew about order and hierarchy had just been torn down in an instant. The courtroom, usually a place of rehearsed monotony, had become an arena charged with raw, unpredictable electricity. The judge slammed his gavel against the bench so hard that the crack echoed like a gunshot. "This is unlawful. Get out of that seat immediately." His voice rose, desperate to reassert dominance, but it sounded strangely hollow. Authority only works when others agree to it, and in that moment the crowd wasn't sure who they were agreeing with anymore. The officer who had struck her earlier shifted uneasily, his uniform suddenly feeling less like armor and more like a costume. His hand hovered near her shoulder as if to yank her back to the floor, but he hesitated. Maybe it was fear of the crowd watching him, their eyes no longer on her but on him, judging, recording every twitch of his jaw, every bead of sweat at his temple. Or maybe it was fear of her composure, the way she radiated something he couldn't touch or suppress. And then came the murmurs. From the gallery, hushed voices spread like cracks in glass. "She's sitting in the chair. She's not moving. Do you see this?" Words became whispers. Whispers became gasps. Gasps became something louder, more dangerous. The air was thick with a collective realization. They weren't witnessing an outburst. They were witnessing history bend. The judge's eyes darted to the bailiffs, ordering them with a glance. But even they hesitated. To drag her out by force would be to prove her point, that justice in that room was nothing more than violence dressed in robes. And if they touched her again, who knew what kind of storm might erupt? She leaned forward in the chair, her hands resting calmly on the wooden arms, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, smooth and clear, slicing through the tension. "You think this seat makes you powerful?" she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It doesn't. It only reflects the power we let you believe you have." The words struck deeper than any gavel. The gallery erupted, some people clapping instinctively, others gasping, others muttering under their breath. The judge's face flushed crimson, his authority crumbling under the weight of her defiance. For years, people had sat in that gallery and swallowed their anger, forced into silence by the rituals of the court. But her presence, her audacity, cracked something open inside them. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every injustice they had endured quietly, every humiliation they had forced themselves to swallow. The officer finally snapped, his composure unraveling. "This is disorderly conduct," he barked, his voice trembling as much from anger as from uncertainty. He moved forward, but the crowd's reaction stopped him cold. Dozens of eyes locked on him, fierce and unyielding. For the first time, the badge on his chest didn't shield him. It exposed him. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in the chair, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp as glass. She looked untouchable, not because she held any legal authority, but because she had stepped into a space no one dared to imagine possible. Outside the courtroom, word began to spread. Phones buzzed. Texts flew. A story was unraveling faster than the system could contain it. Soon the world beyond those walls would know. A black woman, struck by an officer in a courtroom, had taken the judge's seat, and she hadn't moved. That image, the slap, the chair, her unshaken presence, was already burning itself into the collective memory of everyone who witnessed it. And once a story like that takes root, no gavel, no uniform, no shouted command can erase it. News doesn't always break with headlines. Sometimes it breaks with whispers, with shaky hands typing messages, with the grainy glow of a phone camera capturing a moment too explosive to remain contained. That's how it began here. Even before the gavel struck again, even before the officer decided his next move, screens were already lighting up outside the courtroom. Someone in the gallery had pressed record at the exact moment the slap landed. The sound cracked through the video like lightning, followed by the stunned silence, followed by her deliberate steps toward the bench. By the time she lowered herself into the judge's chair, the clip had already traveled beyond the four walls of the courthouse. It leapt from one phone to another, carried by trembling fingers and gasping voices, spreading like wildfire. On social media, the first caption appeared within minutes. They hit her in court, and she sat in the judge's seat. No explanation, no context, just shock. Then another, history in the making. The comments came in waves, some cheering, some outraged, others stunned into disbelief. Algorithms pushed the video further, faster, feeding the hunger of a world addicted to moments that shatter the ordinary. Back inside the courtroom, the tension thickened, but now it was joined by something else. Awareness. People began glancing down at their phones, the glow of screens illuminating faces pale with astonishment. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were broadcasters, and every second that passed, the story grew harder to contain. The judge knew it too. His eyes darted around, panic thinly veiled behind authority. He had spent decades believing in the sanctity of that chair, the unchallenged dominance of the bench. But now, in real time, that sanctity was dissolving into pixels, becoming content, becoming symbol. And no gavel could stop a symbol once it had escaped. She sat there calmly, almost serene, while the world outside erupted. People in coffee shops tilted their heads toward screens, jaws dropping as the video replayed again and again. News outlets scrambled, anchors cutting into regular programming with breathless voices. Some labeled her reckless, others called her revolutionary, but none could deny the gravity of the image. A black woman, struck in a courtroom, refusing to be diminished, choosing instead to sit where no one believed she could. Outside the courthouse, a crowd began to gather. It started with a handful of people who had rushed down after seeing the video online. Then dozens, then hundreds. Their chants rose through the streets, carried by car horns and beating drums. Some held hastily made signs. Others simply raised their fists. They weren't waiting for verdicts or press releases. They were there for her. Inside, the officer shifted again, torn between orders and hesitation. The crowd outside could now be heard faintly through the windows, a low roar building into a thunder. He knew that if he laid a hand on her again, it wouldn't just be a courtroom issue. It would be an uprising. She heard the sound too. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of arrogance, but of recognition. The slap that was supposed to silence her had done the opposite. It had given her a stage, a megaphone, a movement, and all she had done was sit down. The judge slammed the gavel again, desperate, his voice cracking. "Remove her now!" But no one moved. Not the officers, not the bailiffs, not even the crowd in the gallery. Authority had become theater, and his script was no longer being followed. Out in the streets, the chants grew louder. She sat in the chair. She sat in the chair. It was simple, powerful, impossible to ignore. Within hours, her act would ripple across cities, across headlines, across dinner tables and classrooms. For some, it was a scandal. For others, it was salvation. But for everyone, it was unforgettable. And as she sat, still and steady, with the storm building both inside and outside the courthouse, the question began to form on every lip, in every mind. What happens next? By nightfall, the story had escaped the confines of one city and spread like a storm across the nation. What began as a shaky phone video had now been replayed on every major news network, dissected by commentators, politicized by pundits, and shared endlessly online. The headline varied depending on the source, but the image remained the same. A black woman, dignified and unyielding, sitting in the judge's chair with eyes that refused to bow. Some networks framed it as chaos. Their anchors leaned forward with tightened jaws, describing her as disruptive, dangerous, a symbol of disorder. They replayed the moment of the slap but cut quickly to her seated in the chair, painting her as an aggressor who had crossed a line sacred to the justice system. Politicians eager to score points seized on the narrative, declaring her act an insult to law and order. But others saw something entirely different. They played the full clip, uncut, showing the officer's hand striking her face, showing her stillness, her deliberate steps, the sheer audacity of her calm. Their words carried awe, calling her a figure of resistance, a mirror of justice, a woman who redefined what courage looks like. Social media platforms split in two, hashtags dueling across timelines. Hashtag lawless or hashtag she sat in the chair. Comment sections became battlegrounds. One post read, "She disrespected the system. Throw her in jail." Another shot back, "The system disrespected her first. She just claimed the seat they said she'd never touch." Arguments flared. Families debated over dinner tables. Teachers found their classrooms buzzing with students who couldn't stop talking about it. Everyone had an opinion, and beneath those opinions, one truth lingered. Nobody could ignore her anymore. Journalists dug into her past, uncovering fragments of the life that had led her here. They spoke to neighbors who recalled her sharp mind and unshakable will. They tracked down professors who remembered her challenging every assumption in class. Some painted her as a lifelong troublemaker. Others painted her as a visionary who had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it. And the footage itself, those few minutes of grainy courtroom drama, was watched again and again, analyzed frame by frame. Body language experts were brought onto morning shows, pausing the clip at the exact moment of the slap, the exact moment she touched the judge's chair, the exact moment she sat down. "Look at her composure," one said. "That's not rebellion. That's mastery." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown. By dawn the next day, tents lined the sidewalks, banners hung from lampposts, chants rising like hymns in the cold morning air. People brought food, water, music. They weren't waiting for permission. They were declaring allegiance to an idea, to a woman who had turned a slap into a symbol. Inside her apartment, now surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras, she watched the coverage unfold. Her phone buzzed constantly. Journalists, activists, strangers sending messages of solidarity or scorn. She knew the storm was no longer just about her. It was about something larger that had cracked open. And though the world argued heroine or criminal, disruptor or visionary, one thing was clear. The slap that was supposed to humiliate her had transformed her into the most talked-about woman in the country. And her image, seated calmly in the judge's chair, was no longer just a moment. It was a movement. For most people, sudden notoriety is a jolt, a bolt of electricity that leaves you trembling in the aftermath. For her, it was something else entirely. A mirror reflecting every choice, every sacrifice, every quiet moment of preparation that had led her here. She didn't feel famous. She felt exposed. Every whisper, every click of a camera shutter, every live-streamed replay was now a window into her life, her history, her resilience. Her apartment, once a refuge, had become a cage. Reporters lingered outside, drones hovered overhead. Neighbors whispered speculations she could hear through closed windows. And yet, inside, she remained composed. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in her hands, letting the noise outside wash over her while she plotted her next steps. She wasn't afraid, not really. But the magnitude of what had happened, the slap, the chair, the viral spread, made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about privacy, control, and influence. Her phone never stopped buzzing. Friends sent encouragement. Activists sent praise. Some messages were harsher. Threats thinly veiled as criticism. Warnings from strangers who seemed to believe that the audacity of her act demanded punishment. She read each one carefully, cataloging the tone, the intent, the fear, the awe. She understood instinctively that perception could be more powerful than action. People's interpretations could shape reality, sometimes more than reality itself. Even her family felt the weight. Her mother called late at night, voice trembling between pride and worry. "Are you safe?" she asked, though the question carried layers beyond the physical. Safety wasn't just about avoiding harm. It was about navigating a world suddenly laser-focused on you. Her younger brother sent a message filled with excitement. "You went viral. Everyone's talking about you." And she smiled at that, She wanted him to see courage, not chaos. Despite the attention, she carved moments of silence. She walked the streets at night when the city was quiet, allowing herself to breathe without an audience. She replayed the events in her mind, not to relive them, but to understand them. Each memory of the slap, each step toward the bench, each heartbeat as she lowered herself into the chair. She analyzed it all. The fear, the defiance, the calm resolve. She saw patterns that could teach her how to move forward, how to wield this moment without losing herself. And then came the invitations, talk shows, interviews, panels. Some wanted her to tell her story in her own words. Others wanted to frame her as a spectacle, a symbol to be debated. She approached each opportunity cautiously. She understood that words have power, perhaps even more than a viral act, because words can shape legacy. She chose them deliberately, revealing enough to inspire, but not enough to compromise the depth of her experience. At night, alone in her apartment, she sometimes wondered how different things would have been if she had turned away, if she had obeyed the unspoken rules. But then she remembered the slap, the air thick with judgment, the murmurs of the gallery. And she realized, the chair hadn't chosen her. She had chosen the chair. And in that choice lay her power, her voice, her defiance, and now the world was listening. Yet with attention came danger. The viral moment painted a target she couldn't ignore. Every step outside carried risk. Strangers, opportunists, those who hated the disruption of their comfortable order. She had learned long ago how to navigate adversity, but this was different. The world was bigger now, louder, more scrutinizing, and she had to remain vigilant without becoming consumed by fear. It was a delicate balance. Presence and patience, visibility and strategy, courage and caution. And as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, watching the world react, she understood that the true challenge had only just begun. Not the chair, not the slap, not the viral video, but the life that awaited her afterward. The ripple of her act had moved far beyond the courthouse walls. Communities across the city began to stir, inspired by a woman who had turned humiliation into defiance, a single slap into a symbol. Neighborhoods, previously quiet with resignation, now buzzed with conversation. People debated what she had done, what it meant, and how it could change the way they saw their own power. Local activists were the first to respond. They organized meetings, small gatherings at community centers and libraries, where they dissected the video, discussed the nuances of courage, and strategized how to amplify the message. Flyers began appearing overnight, urging people to come together to support her act as a statement against systemic injustice. The hashtag she sat in the chair trended locally, but it was more than just a tag. It became a call to action, a mantra, a symbol of resistance. Schools, too, felt the shockwave. Students in classrooms whispered about the woman who defied the system with nothing but poise and determination. Teachers used the story to illustrate lessons on civic engagement, standing up for oneself, and questioning authority in meaningful, nonviolent ways. Teenagers debated on social media, drawing parallels to historical acts of civil disobedience, to figures who had dared to challenge power and pay the price. Neighborhoods began holding discussions on justice and equality, inspired by her courage. In one small hall, a circle of women of all ages sat together, recounting personal experiences of being dismissed, belittled, or struck down. The energy was electric, pain transformed into purpose. And while she had not yet left the courthouse, she had already sparked a movement, one that didn't require her presence to flourish. Meanwhile, local media outlets covered these grassroots responses with growing intensity. Interviews with community leaders and scholars painted her as a catalyst, someone whose simple act had ignited conversations that had long been dormant. Comparisons were drawn to historical moments of defiance, and suddenly, she was being placed alongside figures who had once shifted the trajectory of public consciousness. Even in more ordinary spaces, her impact was felt. Shopkeepers discussed the video with customers. Bus drivers repeated her story over the radio. Parents recounted the moment to children as an example of standing firm in the face of injustice. The act that had begun in a courtroom had evolved into a narrative that crossed age, class, and geography, uniting people in astonishment and reflection. Yet with admiration came tension. Not everyone was pleased with the disruption. Certain authorities and conservative commentators condemned the gatherings, insisting that respect for institutions had been violated. They painted the movement as reckless, dangerous, and destabilizing. But the more they condemned her, the more attention the story received. Resistance begets curiosity, and curiosity begets awareness. Amidst this growing wave of public attention, she remained poised. From the judge's chair, she continued to observe the world outside, aware that her act had unlocked a potential far beyond herself. She was no longer just a woman asserting her right to dignity. She was a symbol, an idea, a spark. And sparks have a way of igniting fires that no one can easily extinguish. The city felt different now. The air vibrated with possibility. People walked taller, spoke louder, demanded more. They felt the echo of her courage resonate within them. And even as debates raged over legality, morality, and power, the central truth remained. A single act of defiance had awakened a community, and perhaps the beginning of a movement. As the movement grew, so did the resistance. Authorities, once content to enforce quiet obedience, suddenly realized the magnitude of what had transpired. The slap, the chair, the viral video, it had become more than an isolated incident. It had evolved into a story that challenged not only their authority in that courtroom, but the perception of power itself. And with perception came panic. Legal measures were considered almost immediately. Court officials convened in hushed rooms, discussing restraining orders, contempt charges, and possible arrests. Lawyers debated whether her act could be classified as a breach of decorum, a disruption of judicial proceedings, or even public disorder. Every legal avenue seemed to point toward containment, but containment was no longer simple. The world had already seen her. The moment was already immortalized. Threats began to trickle in. Anonymous messages, calls from numbers that never existed, letters delivered to her apartment. But each attempt only underscored her growing influence. It was clear. The institutions that had tried to suppress her defiance were now desperate to reclaim control. But the very act they wished to erase had already left a permanent mark. Despite the growing danger, she refused to yield. Each threat, each legal maneuver, each attempt to diminish her presence only reinforced her resolve. Her family worried, their protective instincts clashing with the undeniable power of her stance. Friends pleaded for caution. Yet, deep down, she knew that courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward in spite of it. Inside the courtroom, tensions escalated further. The judge, increasingly agitated, attempted procedural tricks, calling for recesses, summoning additional officers, and demanding identification from those supporting her. But the energy had shifted irreversibly. Officers who had once obeyed without question now hesitated. The gallery watched the back and forth with bated breath, aware that authority was cracking under the weight of an idea that could not be silenced. Meanwhile, social media amplified every reaction. Clips of confrontations, statements from activists, and debates about judicial decorum spread faster than any order could enforce. Hashtags proliferated. Hashtag she sat in the chair. Hashtag justice reimagined. Hashtag power in defiance. People around the nation debated, argued, and rallied. News outlets scrambled to cover developments, balancing condemnation with fascination, criticism with awe. Every attempt by authorities to quiet the narrative only fueled it further. She, however, remained calm. Each new legal maneuver or threat was a test, a challenge to her patience and strategic thinking. She navigated it like a chess player, anticipating moves, considering consequences, and acting with deliberate care. Her composure became a lesson. Defiance, when executed with clarity and principle, can be unshakable. Even as authorities explored ways to remove her from the chair, the public's fascination turned into loyalty. Volunteers, legal advisors, and activists began mobilizing, offering support in ways that were impossible to anticipate. The movement became both shield and amplifier, turning what was meant to be punishment into protection and amplification of her voice. The tension had reached a point where every decision in that courtroom, every step she took, every word she uttered, carried enormous weight. What had started as a single act, simple, audacious, almost spontaneous, had evolved into a confrontation not just over law, but over the narrative of power, authority, and justice itself. By now, it was clear that sitting in the judge's chair had become more than a moment. It was a statement, a challenge, and a catalyst all at once. But she understood something critical. Symbolic acts could only carry you so far. To survive, to amplify, to endure, she needed strategy. Not brute force, not impulsive reactions, but calculated, deliberate action. Her first step was understanding the terrain. She studied every law, every precedent, every loophole that could be leveraged to protect herself. Lawyers who had once dismissed her presence now sought her guidance, intrigued by her composure and foresight. She absorbed advice with a discerning eye, weighing every suggestion, anticipating how the system might respond. Knowledge became her shield, precision her weapon. Simultaneously, she engaged the public in subtle, deliberate ways. Social media had transformed into an extension of her voice. Carefully crafted posts, short messages of defiance and resilience, snippets that spoke to justice and dignity, began circulating. Each post was measured, not reactionary, but resonant, creating ripples that amplified her influence without inflaming unnecessary conflict. Her followers grew exponentially, not just in numbers but in commitment. People saw her as more than a viral sensation. They saw her as a symbol of moral clarity in a world where authority often overstepped. Even within the courtroom, she moved with intention. She responded to each attempt to intimidate her with calm, measured gestures. When officers approached, she spoke softly, firmly, reminding them of the law, her rights, and the optics of force. Each interaction became a lesson in restraint, turning potential confrontations into demonstrations of control. The courtroom became a stage and she, the choreographer. Her family, once tense with fear, began to understand her approach. They learned to trust her judgment, to follow her lead in public statements, and to manage the chaos that now defined her life. Her inner circle became a combination of protectors, strategists, and advisors, each understanding the delicate balance between safety and influence. At night, when the world quieted, she reflected on her growing role. Sitting in that judge's chair had been a leap, yes, but the real journey had just begun. The viral moment had sparked conversation. Now it was time to turn that conversation into sustained change, to speak not just to the injustice of a slap, but to the systemic issues it represented, to show that courage combined with intelligence could dismantle fear, piece by piece. And as she planned, she noticed something remarkable. The people she had inspired were not waiting for permission. Communities began holding their own forums. Teachers used her story to guide lessons on justice, activists coordinated events, and ordinary citizens spread the message. The act of sitting in that chair had evolved into a movement that was autonomous, self-sustaining, and growing exponentially. She realized a profound truth. True influence is not about controlling people. It is about inspiring action so powerful that it moves without you. Sitting in the judge's chair had been the spark. Strategy, foresight, and presence would ensure the fire continued to burn. By the following week, the story had become a national phenomenon. The video of her sitting in the judge's chair was no longer a moment. It was a symbol, a rallying cry that reverberated far beyond the courthouse. People across the country held gatherings in solidarity, from quiet vigils in small towns to massive rallies in major cities. Every protest, every chant, every sign carried the weight of a singular act: courage in the face of authority. Political figures scrambled to respond. Some condemned her publicly, emphasizing law, order, and decorum. Their speeches, full of traditional rhetoric, often seemed disconnected, even impotent, against the tide of public sentiment that had shifted. Others, sensing the momentum, cautiously expressed support, framing her actions as emblematic of deeper systemic issues, promising investigations and reforms. The dichotomy was striking. She had become a litmus test for national values, forcing politicians to choose sides, to declare allegiance in ways that would shape public perception for years to come. Celebrities and influencers joined the conversation, lending visibility and credibility to the movement. Their posts amplified the story exponentially, introducing her act to audiences that had never stepped foot in that courtroom or considered the subtle dynamics of power at play. Interviews and panels dissected not just the legalities of her action, but the symbolism behind it, the audacity, the calm, the moral clarity that transformed a single slap into a nationwide discussion about dignity, justice, and authority. Local communities continued to mobilize independently. Neighborhoods organized teach-ins, workshops, and discussion circles. Schools held special sessions exploring civic responsibility, historical acts of resistance, and the power of presence in moments of injustice. Activist networks coordinated nationwide events, using her story as the centerpiece to discuss policy, reform, and social equity. What began as a personal stand in a single courtroom had become an educational and cultural phenomenon, inspiring reflection and action on multiple levels. Meanwhile, the media framed the story in ever-widening circles. Editorials debated morality, legality, and courage. Late-night hosts replayed the footage, adding commentary that ranged from humorous to profound. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to analyzing her strategy, the symbolism, and the societal implications of her defiance. In classrooms, living rooms, and social media feeds, her presence was impossible to ignore. She remained poised at the center of it all. Every statement, every appearance, every interview was carefully considered. She refused to be sensationalized or reduced to a caricature. Her words were precise, her demeanor calm. The power of the chair had not just been in sitting. It had been in proving that composure, intellect, and moral clarity could amplify influence far beyond physical presence. And yet, the stakes were higher than ever. National attention brought scrutiny, threats, and pressure unlike anything she had faced before. Every move was analyzed, every word dissected, and every gesture recorded. But she understood that true impact comes with risk. Courage was not the absence of danger, it was embracing it, and in doing so, forcing the world to reckon with its own principles. Across the nation, people continued to march, speak, and organize. The image of her in the judge's chair became iconic. Printed on posters, shared in digital campaigns, etched into the consciousness of a country waking up to a new reality. The movement she had ignited was alive, breathing, and unstoppable, fueled by the clarity of one act and the vision of what could come next. With national attention came polarization. The story of her sitting in the judge's chair was no longer just a viral video. It had become a battlefield of ideas, opinions, and ideologies. News networks debated endlessly, talk shows invited pundits to argue, and social media timelines were flooded with hashtags championing or condemning her. Hashtag she sat in the chair collided with hashtag disrespectful, and every post sparked hundreds of reactions, dividing communities and families alike. Commentators questioned morality, legality, and decorum, while historians and activists highlighted the symbolic power of her act. Newspapers published op-eds analyzing the deeper meaning of a single slap transformed into an act of defiance. Some painted her as reckless, dangerous, and defiant of the law. Others praised her as a visionary, courageous, and prophetic, standing for dignity in a system designed to suppress it. Every critique, every endorsement became a public forum, and her name was at the center of it all. She faced personal attacks too. Emails, messages, and calls criticized her choices, questioned her motives, and even threatened consequences. Yet, she learned to filter, not ignore, but sift through the noise to find what was actionable and what was merely distraction. Public pressure became a teacher, showing her how to remain grounded while navigating the storm of opinion swirling around her. She understood that in the age of virality, every misstep could be amplified, every gesture dissected, and every word interpreted in countless ways. Despite the intensity, she remained composed. Public statements were deliberate, measured, and pointed. She reframed criticism as an opportunity to educate, turning debates into dialogues about systemic inequality, courage, and the moral imperative to resist injustice. Each interview became a lesson, each panel discussion a platform to articulate the principles behind her actions. The viral moment was no longer just a story, it was a framework for dialogue, teaching the world how defiance, intelligence, and ethics could intersect. Communities that had embraced her movement continued to grow stronger. Local leaders used her story as a springboard to organize educational forums, civic workshops, and advocacy campaigns. Her example became a model for action, showing people how symbolic gestures could catalyze real-world change. Even as authorities scrutinized her every move, supporters mobilized, ensuring she was not isolated. Networks of lawyers, activists, and volunteers began coordinating to offer protection, guidance, and amplification of her message. The polarizing reactions only reinforced the significance of her act. Every attack, every criticism, and every attempt to delegitimize her position illuminated the power structures she had challenged. And the more polarized the conversation became, the more visible the truth. Courage, once witnessed, cannot be erased. The act of sitting in the judge's chair had transcended a moment of defiance. It had ignited a conversation about justice, equality, and moral responsibility that would not be easily contained. In private, she reflected on the paradox of influence. To make a difference, she had to remain steadfast yet adaptable, defiant yet strategic, visible yet protected. Criticism would always follow, but she learned to transform it into clarity, insight, and strength. The pressure, instead of breaking her, refined her, teaching that the balance of resilience and prudence was the true measure of power. By standing firm amidst the storm of debate, she became not only the woman who sat in the judge's chair, but a living emblem of the courage required to challenge entrenched systems, an example of how one act could ripple outward to touch the lives of thousands, and the embodiment of a movement that refused to be silenced. As the story dominated national headlines, it wasn't long before international media picked it up. Outlets in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America began running segments, analyzing the unprecedented act of defiance. "A courtroom slap sparks a movement," read one headline in London. "The woman who dared to sit where she was forbidden," proclaimed a French news site. Every report carried images of her poised in the judge's chair, calm and unwavering, the viral video looping endlessly across networks. Social media amplified the effect. Hashtags translated into multiple languages, spreading awareness and admiration globally. Hashtag "She Sat in the Chair" became a symbol not confined to a single culture or nation. It resonated with anyone who had felt powerless, ignored, or marginalized. Across continents, people shared the video with messages of solidarity. From students in Berlin to activists in Johannesburg, from office workers in Tokyo to community organizers in Sao Paulo. The story transcended borders because it spoke a universal language: courage against oppression. In some countries, debates mirrored the national discourse but adapted to local context. Commentators compared her act to historical figures who had challenged authority, from civil rights leaders to political dissidents. Talk shows dissected the legality and ethics, while opinion pieces explored its cultural significance. The narrative was polarizing, yes, but it also ignited hope. It reminded people worldwide that defiance could be deliberate, dignified, and powerful. Grassroots movements began to reference her story. In Europe, student groups cited her as an example of moral courage, organizing seminars on standing against systemic injustice. In South America, activists shared her video to highlight inequality and spark discussions on accountability. In Africa, panels debated the symbolism of her act, connecting it to long histories of resilience against authority. The courtroom incident, once a local event, had evolved into a global case study in courage, morality, and resistance. Even international celebrities and thought leaders weighed in. Some praised her audacity, using her example to encourage public discourse on justice and fairness. Others framed it as a cautionary tale about challenging authority, yet their critiques inadvertently drew more attention to her cause. The paradox was clear. Every attempt to discredit her only amplified her message, creating an international echo chamber of admiration, curiosity, and debate. Back home, she absorbed this global attention with measured composure. She understood that the stakes were higher than ever. International scrutiny brought opportunities but also risks. Every statement she made could resonate thousands of miles away, influencing perceptions far beyond her immediate environment. Yet she remained deliberate. Each interview, each post, each interaction was a balance of caution and principle, ensuring that her message, about dignity, courage, and justice, remained clear and intact. Through this international spotlight, she began to see a larger truth. Courage is contagious. One act, performed with clarity and integrity, can inspire thousands, then millions, across borders, languages, and cultures. She wasn't just a woman in a courtroom anymore. She was a global symbol, proof that standing firm in the face of injustice could reverberate far beyond what anyone might imagine. And yet, with this recognition came responsibility. The movement now had a worldwide audience, each expecting leadership, insight, and guidance. The simple act of sitting in a chair had become a foundation upon which millions looked for inspiration. And she understood, as the world watched, that the next steps mattered more than the moment that had started it all. The international spotlight brought not only admiration but scrutiny and resistance from powerful institutions. Governments and judicial authorities, alarmed by the global attention, began examining ways to assert control over the narrative. Diplomats exchanged urgent messages, embassies issued statements, and foreign officials debated whether her actions could inspire unrest or challenge established norms in their own countries. The ripple effect of a single courtroom act had reached the corridors of power worldwide. Media outlets in some countries framed her as reckless, a dangerous symbol of defiance. Editorials questioned whether the viral video threatened the sanctity of justice, using strong language that emphasized disorder, disrespect, and irresponsibility. Opinion polls in multiple nations reflected this divide. A segment of the population praised her bravery, while another criticized her for undermining authority. The more authorities tried to discredit her, the more the public became captivated, sensing a truth that official rhetoric could not erase. diplomatic tensions began surfacing subtly. Officials worried that such acts, amplified globally, could embolden citizens in other nations to challenge power structures. Behind closed doors, conversations turned strategic. How could they diminish her influence without appearing oppressive themselves? How could they protect their institutions while acknowledging that a viral act had captured hearts worldwide? The questions themselves revealed the unprecedented nature of her influence. Yet attempts at discrediting her often backfired. Criticism from foreign leaders and official channels only amplified curiosity. Every attack became fodder for discussion, debate, and analysis. International think tanks and advocacy groups dissected her story, exploring the morality, legality, and symbolism, unintentionally expanding her reach. Social media users shared these critiques with captions highlighting hypocrisy or injustice, creating an ironic amplification effect. Despite the mounting international pressure, she remained composed. She understood that leadership in the digital age demanded more than courage. It required strategic communication. Each statement she issued, each interview she granted, was carefully crafted to emphasize principles over provocation. Her message, justice, dignity, and resilience, remained unwavering, even as adversaries sought to tarnish her image. Meanwhile, supporters across borders mobilized. Activists in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America organized discussions, petitions, and forums that referenced her act as a model of ethical resistance. Her story became a teaching tool, a point of reference in university courses, civic workshops, and online seminars. The act of sitting in a judge's chair had transcended geography. It became a global symbol, inspiring reflection and action on multiple continents. Even as international authorities maneuvered to control the narrative, they had inadvertently validated her influence. The fact that governments were concerned, that debates had reached diplomatic levels, confirmed the power of her act. She had transformed a personal moment of defiance into a challenge to authority itself, a lesson in moral courage that could not be silenced by borders, law, or criticism. And in this intricate web of admiration, scrutiny, and strategic calculation, she realized the scale of her responsibility. The viral moment was no longer sufficient. Leadership required vision, foresight, and unwavering adherence to principle. The world was watching, and she had to ensure that the story she started would inspire, educate, and endure, despite every attempt to undermine it. The global spotlight, intense and unrelenting, could have overwhelmed anyone. But she saw it differently. The attention, the debates, the polarized commentary, it was a resource, a tool to be used with precision to create impact far beyond the viral moment that had launched her into the international arena. She understood that courage alone could ignite awareness, but action could cement change. Her first step was organizing collaborative initiatives. With legal experts, activists, educators, and community leaders from around the world, she helped establish forums to discuss systemic injustice, judicial reform, and civic empowerment. These forums were both digital and in-person, spanning continents, languages, and cultures. They weren't just about her story, they were about using it as a lens to examine broader societal issues. Her influence became a bridge between disparate communities, connecting people through shared concern and shared hope. Programs were initiated to educate young people about rights, advocacy, and ethical leadership. Workshops, mentorship programs, and online courses were developed, each referencing her act as an example of courage, strategy, and moral clarity. Students in classrooms from Tokyo to Sao Paulo debated the implications of standing firm against authority, learning that ethical resistance is a skill, a responsibility, and a practice. Her personal engagement amplified these initiatives. She appeared on global panels, participated in webinars, and conducted interviews with thought leaders. Yet she remained deliberate, never allowing herself to be reduced to a symbol or a headline. Every word was measured, every appearance purposeful. She emphasized that the viral act was not a stunt. It was a catalyst for action, a challenge to complacency, and a demonstration of moral courage in practice. Community projects began multiplying organically. Local leaders, inspired by her example, initiated programs addressing inequality, access to justice, and civic engagement. Social media campaigns highlighted local heroes, amplifying voices that had long been ignored. Her story became a framework, a guide, a blueprint for activism that could be adapted across cultures and contexts. The chair she had sat in became a metaphorical platform for countless initiatives worldwide. Even as her influence expanded, she remained aware of the responsibilities it carried. Mistakes could be magnified, criticism could turn viral, and threats remained real. She balanced visibility with caution, speaking when her voice could clarify, and listening when action required reflection. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about being seen. It was about guiding, inspiring, and enabling others to act with integrity. Through these initiatives, she began to see the tangible impact of her courage. Communities were not only inspired, they were empowered. Conversations became plans, discussions became programs, and symbolic defiance became actionable change. The momentum she had sparked had moved from a viral sensation to a global movement, with structures, strategies, and objectives. In private moments, she reflected on the journey from that courtroom slap to the initiatives now unfolding worldwide. It was surreal, overwhelming, and profoundly satisfying. One act of defiance, executed with clarity and courage, had become a force for systemic reflection, moral education, and social empowerment. The chair had been a seat of defiance, but now it had become a catalyst for transformation that could not be contained by walls, borders, or authority. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The true measure of impact would not be in viral clips or headlines, but in the lasting change that emerged from courage, strategy, and principled action. Months had passed since that viral moment in the courtroom, and the results of her efforts were becoming undeniable. Grassroots initiatives she had inspired were flourishing. Community workshops in cities across the globe had trained thousands of young leaders in civic engagement, legal literacy, and ethical resistance. Educational programs had reached students in remote villages and urban centers alike, teaching that courage combined with strategy could affect real change. The movement had achieved cohesion. Local, national, and international networks coordinated seamlessly, sharing strategies, resources, and stories of impact. Reports of empowered citizens challenging injustices, advocating for fairness, and holding authorities accountable began to pour in. The symbol of the chair, once a single act of defiance, had transformed into a framework for systemic reflection, demonstrating how individual courage can catalyze collective action. Her personal life, though still under scrutiny, reflected a sense of purpose and control. She had mastered the delicate balance of visibility and privacy, influence and discretion. Each public statement, each interview, each forum she participated in became an opportunity not just to share her story, but to guide the movement's evolution. She was no longer just the woman who had sat in the judge's chair. She was a mentor, a strategist, and a beacon of resilience. Across the globe, the conversation about justice, dignity, and moral courage had changed. Citizens, inspired by her example, began questioning systems that had previously gone unchallenged. Legal reforms were discussed, activist coalitions strengthened, and educational institutions adapted curricula to include the lessons drawn from her act. The viral video that once captured fleeting attention had now seeded long-term change. Yet, through it all, she never lost sight of the lesson that had begun her journey. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to act despite it. Every slap, every step to the judge's chair, every viral clip had been a decision, and every initiative that followed was an extension of that choice. Power, she realized, did not come from viral fame or public adoration. It came from integrity, foresight, and the willingness to transform a single moment into lasting impact. As the world continued to respond, politicians, educators, activists, and citizens alike, she addressed her followers one final time, directly and deliberately. If you've been inspired by this journey, don't just watch. Stand up in your own way, speak out when it matters, and remember that courage paired with strategy can change the world. Subscribe, comment, and share your voice. Let's keep this movement alive, together. Her message resonated widely, amplifying a call to action that was both personal and collective. The Courtroom Act had sparked conversation, the initiatives had sparked change, and now her words sparked commitment. The movement had come full circle, from a moment of defiance to a legacy of empowerment, proving that one person's courage, when guided by principle and strategy, could indeed ignite a global transformation. In the end, the chair was more than a seat. It was a symbol, a catalyst, and a reminder. True change begins when one individual chooses to act, and the world is forced to follow. And now, the world was not just watching, it was moving,